Will Trump deliver on his cannabis promises? Everyone is acting like Schedule 3 is like a big win, a big success. It's honestly not. So you see why they don't give a fuck about legalizing. They're getting paid 30% off every dollar being spent. People still stuck in jail for selling 10 pounds, 5 pounds, 50 pounds, but it's nowhere near the thousands of pounds legally being sold now that these big corporations can. The new head of the DEA, he's never been a proponent of cannabis, and hemp was ultimately the legal access for people to cannabinoids. If you don't know me, I'm Chris. I've been in the wholesale business here in California since 2004, and I've also held one of California's earliest state distribution licenses since day one of legalization in 2018. I've also built and sold a licensed cultivation facility that I scaled from 0 to $3 million and then successfully exited prior to launching Zodix back in 2022. Zodix has been in over 100 licensed retail stores throughout California, and I followed that up with my other brand, Lowski, in 2024, offering fire indoor at low prices. Today, I teach entrepreneurs how to hit $100,000 months with their licensed brand without having to own a license. We go over how to scale your cannabis brand every day on our private school community, as well as one-on-one guidance, breaking down exactly how to roll out your brand in the licensed market without owning a license. Both links are in the description below. So I'm gonna touch on a few things that Trump has publicly said about cannabis, as well as some of the things he's done in his first term, and we'll see if that translates to his second term. So number one is reschedule. And this is gonna drop it currently. I'm doing my best to avoid using the word, so that way YouTube doesn't age restrict this video. So we all know what this is. So to reschedule it, currently it's on Schedule 1. They're talking about rescheduling it to Schedule 3. What Schedule 1 means is it is federally illegal on all levels. No medicinal value. And what that means is basically the state or the feds, the government do not care one bit about it. They think it's horrible, it's dangerous, it's not any benefits to offer. And so Schedule 1 also has other drugs like cocaine, heroin, LSD. Basically all the major drugs are Schedule 1. And so cannabis is lumped into that with zero medical benefits. That's how the feds look at it. That's how the government looks at it, that there's zero medical benefit. We all know that that's not true. So in the instance of now, they're looking to reschedule it from 1 to 3. And if they hit Schedule 3, what that means is there is medicinal benefits. However, it still needs to be regulated, such as how Vicodin, pharmaceuticals, any other painkiller or any sort of controlled pharmaceutical is considered Schedule 3. The difference though, Schedule 3 allows you to do banking, traditional business operations. When I say traditional, I mean like actual business, like the same way a convenience store, a grocery store, a liquor store, any of those are gonna operate. They're gonna be able to file their taxes properly. They're gonna be able to write off expenses. They're gonna be able to use regular bank accounts, things like that. So Schedule 3 will allow that to happen for cannabis businesses, licensed ones. However, the other thing it's gonna do is open it up for medical research. And that's a slippery slope, because what's gonna happen is we wanna know the research. We definitely want that. We wanna know what it's doing, what the capabilities are, what cannabis can provide for people. And we want hard, actual studies done, peer-reviewed studies, just like anything else in this world. They haven't been able to do any of these studies because it's been on Schedule 1 basically longer than we've been alive. So What that means is if it goes to Schedule 3, now they can start doing medical research. Licensed companies can start putting their money in the banks. They can start using banking traditionally. However, the bigger problem that this opens up is now if they switch it to Schedule 3, they do some medical research, and they decide, okay, there's medicinal benefit, but we're only gonna let pharmacies sell weed. And that would be just like Walgreens, CVS, whatever your local pharmacy is where you'd go get a prescription filled. That's the writing on the wall that Schedule 3 could potentially provide, which is not a good thing. Think about it if you had to go get your weed from a pharmacist. First off, they're not gonna give you what you want. They're not gonna have the different strains or the different qualities. It's not gonna be fresh. It's gonna be highly regulated. So by the time you get it, it's gonna be some, who knows, some dust particles in a fucking plastic jar. I don't know. But it would basically negate branding. It would negate the licensed dispensaries potentially in certain states. It would negate the hemp side of things. It would affect a lot of things if it went to Schedule 3. And everyone is acting like Schedule 3 is like a big win, a big success. It's honestly not. It potentially can regulate and limit cannabis much more than it is. The one good thing it could do is bring in investment money. And you might be thinking like, why the fuck would Chris be caring about investment money? And you're right, I don't. But what that does is the expression goes, a rising tide raises all boats. So if you have a boat here and a boat here, and a boat here, fuck it, I don't even need to draw the third one. You know what I'm saying? So if the tide goes down to here, these boats will drop down here. If high tide comes in, these boats are gonna go up here and float. So think about investment money as high tide. And so what's gonna happen, now that you can have regular banking, investment firms, private investors, institutional money, even banks can potentially start giving out business loans to cannabis businesses. So what that does is it raises that tide. Now that tide is going up. And when I say the tide is the money. So it's basically boosting up the entire industry. Even if, say, these boats don't accept any investment money, it doesn't matter. If those boats don't accept investment money, or let's say one does, one doesn't, it doesn't matter. The entire market's gonna raise up because that investment money's coming in to whoever's accepting it, and the people that do accept it are gonna up their businesses. It's gonna open up more sales. It's gonna open up the ability to operate like a real business, actually take out business loans, not having to pay this 280E tax. 280E means that you can't deduct no expenses on a Schedule 1 substance. So like I just said in that first example, weed is currently Schedule 1. And what happens is because it's Schedule 1, you have to abide by 280E. And what 280E is, a cocaine dealer back in the 80s sold a bunch of cocaine, got caught, got indicted, went through the trial, got convicted of selling cocaine. But then he had been filing all his expenses on his taxes. He'd been filing his taxes. He was writing off boats, parties, mansions, trips, exorbitant spending, and these were all business expenses for him to expand his cocaine business. And what happened was there was no law in place to avoid this, so he ended up winning, and the IRS put the 280E law. That's what caused them to make the 280E law, because this cocaine dealer basically made him look like a fool, where he wrote off his entire cocaine business, even though he was indicted for illegally selling cocaine. So the IRS put that in place, which says you can't write off any expenses that derived from any sort of Schedule 1 business. So unfortunately, our business falls under that, and that 280E law doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. So by allowing it to go on to Schedule 3, that 280E law no longer applies because it's only on Schedule 1. So if it goes to 3, it's the end of the 280E law. And what that means is, let's use a retail dispensary, for instance. They have employees, they have rent, they have insurance, they have repairs and maintenance, they have security. So there's a difference between expenses and what's called COGS. COGS is cost of goods sold. And so what COGS means is, let's say you buy your weed for $1,000, then you have packaging. We'll just round that to $1 per eighth times 128 eighths per pound. So you got $128 in packaging costs. You got testing. Say that's at 500 per strain. So adding that up real quick, you have a few other costs in there, your distro, labor. But anyway, let's add this up. Let's just say it adds up to $1,700, right? Now let's say you sell your ace for 20 bucks an eighth wholesale, which means that on the retail shelf, it's gonna sell for $40 to the customer. So let's say you sell your ace for 20 bucks times 128. So you're getting about $25.60 on your flower. So minus that from $1,700, which was your total cost, you're making $860 profit per pound. Okay? So cost of goods means your cost of goods was $1,700, your sell price was $25.60, $860 is your profit. So what it's saying is cost of goods is right here. $1,700 was your cost of goods. So that you can write off. You can't write off on the retail store because this is hard cost of goods. It's weed, it's packaging. It produces that product. If this was the product that's being sold on the shelf, everything that went into it, this foam, everything, the cost of goods sold. So this cost to get it to market to sell it. So that's the only thing you can write off with this 280E law. Cost of goods is good. Now, when you have a store, a retail store, there's really no cost of goods. There's mostly just all expenses. So your cost of goods is paying for those eighths. So like I said, if you buy a $20 eighth and you sell it for 40, you don't have to claim that 20, that's part of cost of goods, but you still made $20 in profit. And then what you can't write off is rent, employees, security, insurance. Some good accountants can roll some of this stuff into cost of goods sold, but you have to do it in a unique kind of way. But for this example, technically these aren't cost of goods sold, these are expenses. And so that 280E law says you can't write off expenses. And so what that means is you're paying tax on all this money. So let's say your expenses each month, let's just say it's $30,000. Normally, you'd be able to write that off and basically it would be non-existent. You wouldn't have to pay any taxes on that. However, since it's not cost of goods, let's just say you have to pay, average tax rate is 30%. Let's even go on the low end, let's say 20%. Let's say you have kids, a family, all this stuff, and let's say that, let's just go with 20% instead of 30%. So 30,000 times 0.20. So that's $6,000 in tax. That's a 20% tax. But true accountants will tell you hold it back 30% for your 280E. So let's say 30,000 times 0.3, 9,000 at 30%. Okay, so basically your expenses are costing you 30K, but just because you're spending that money, now you have to also give the government somewhere between 6 to 9K. So that 30K now all of a sudden turned into 39,000 that your bills are. So you just got an extra $9,000 bill per month to pay to the government, to pay to 280E. So you see why they don't give a fuck about legalizing. They don't give a fuck about decriminalizing, because they're already getting paid fat. They're getting paid 30% off every dollar being spent. That's being spent, not being made. So again, think about expenses. If it costs you $100 to make $50, your expenses are $100. Granted, there's difference between cost of goods and expenses, and a good accountant can manipulate that a bit, but still you're gonna be paying between $6,000 to $9,000 in extra 280E tax. And this is from any cannabis plant touching business. So the way that smart people will do it, or vertically integrated people will do it, is cultivation has the highest amount of cost of goods. Because think about it, it's the only thing that you can say, okay, we're growing these plants, we're harvesting these plants, and that's the goods that we sell. So cost of goods to sell the weed is your nutrients, your soil, your rock wool, cocoa, whatever your grow medium is, your light bill, your electricity, your build out costs, repairs, maintenance, employees, trimming, harvesting, transplanting, any losses incurred, potential depreciation on the building. All these things can be written off in a sense of they're all going against COGS. And even though certain things would be considered expenses, a lot of that can now be rolled into COGS, because as a cultivation, pretty much everything goes into cost of goods. Also on a cultivation, your operating costs, even at my grow, we were somewhere around 100K a month in our operating costs. And if you look at that, most of that can be considered cost of goods, right? But let's say a retail store, okay? Let's use a retail store example. Retail store is receiving those goods. So they're not producing any cost of goods. They have rent, security, insurance, employees. Now let's say cost of goods is buying physical products. So whether that be stizzy vapes, connected cannabis, Zodics, plug play, doesn't matter what they're buying all these brands to put on their shelves, right? This would be cost of goods. These are goods being sold. But the thing is, as a retail, you're receiving those in. The most cost of goods you can add to that is maybe your inventory and metric person. Okay, so that would be potentially believable from the IRS. Like, okay, for us to get these products on our shelf, we need to pay our inventory and our metric person. So we can roll that into cost of goods. Okay, they'll maybe accept that. But your rent, your security, your insurance, your employees, sometimes any losses, you might not even be able to write those off. It all depends on your accountant. So what happens now, yeah, you can write off your products, but you're already getting that money back anyway. If you spend $1,000 on stizzy and you're gonna mark it up, say 100%, you're gonna sell it for $2,000 and you make $1,000, you can write off those cost of goods on the initial products and you'll just pay tax on that income. However, you can't write off rent, you can't write off security, you can't write off insurance, you can't write off employees, you can't write off losses. So let's say all that adds up to, in the cultivation example, it's 100K a month. Let's be lenient on this. Let's say their monthly expenses are 90K a month. Okay? So technically, whatever their accountant can't roll into cost of goods, they're gonna actually pay another 30% on that 90K. So at bro, that is ridiculous. It just makes my stomach turn. So now you're potentially paying an extra $27,000 on top of that 90. So what does that do? That brings your total monthly cost to $117,000, right? $117,000 when really they should only be paying 90. And like I said, I did that example. So your cost of goods, or I mean your expenses each month for the retail is less than the cultivation, but after you factor in your 280E, they're paying more than the cultivation does, even though their monthly expenses are less. So where does that ever make sense? And what other business does that make sense? None, just in cannabis. Maybe cocaine too, but we're talking about cannabis here. So my point being, cost of goods sold versus expenses, huge, huge thing to understand. That's where Schedule 1 and Schedule 3 come into play. Because if right now it's Schedule 1, Schedule 1 equals 280E, no 280E on Schedule 3. Because remember, 280E is defined by Schedule 1 substances. You can't write off expenses. So automatically, if they change it to Schedule 3, automatically it deletes 280E. So think about it. From a government standpoint, in that last example, they're basically literally getting 30% of every dollar your business spends, unless you're a cultivation facility. So what the vertically integrated do is they have their cultivation and their retail. I'm just gonna skip, you could also have manufacturing and distro in the middle there too. But that's not as important in this example. So whether or not they're vertically integrated with cultivation, manufacturing, distro, and retail, or just cultivation and retail, this same thing would apply. Your cultivation is always gonna have the most cost of goods. So what stores that own the retail and cultivation do is they push back all their retail expenses as much as they can to cost of goods on the grow. So what they do is they basically put as much onto the cultivation as possible and then run the retail at a loss and try to book as many of the expenses that this retail would have onto the cultivation business. And granted, you might not be able to expense your rent over, but you could potentially put certain employees over there on the books. Let's say, you know, they're getting paid through the cultivation facility instead of the retail. And so just unique paperwork structuring and things like that, that's where a good accountant comes in. So when they're vertically integrated with a cultivation and retail, they can pile up their expenses back to the cultivation, make the cultivation almost look like it's not being ran efficiently because it's got so many expenses, but it doesn't matter because all those expenses are now not subject to the 280E. They're not subject to that 30%. But if the retail was reporting those expenses, they would be paying an extra 30%, not on just their profit, but on that expenses. 30% extra on those expenses. So it's ridiculous. Plus you can't write them off against your income. That's a really fucked up law. And I'm sure you're hearing about it for the first time. If you're hearing about it the first time, you're like, how is that even possible? It doesn't even fucking make sense. I agree. It's fucking ridiculous. So that was rescheduling. The second thing that Trump talked about was Safe Banking Act. And what that is basically, regardless of whether it's Schedule 1 or Schedule 3, it doesn't matter. That's Safe Banking Act isn't about that. Safe Banking Act is saying, okay, let's assume that it stays at Schedule 1 and there's no rescheduling, right? What Safe Banking Act is, and it's in the legislation, it's been up since I think 2020 or 2021, and they've been trying to get it passed, but it just is not passing. It's not getting the support that it needs. And I think the gut of myself tells me that the government knows they're making all that money off that 280E law. So why are they gonna let this go into place? They're gonna lose 30% on all those expenses from all these cannabis companies. It's ridiculous. So the government's actually making more money now off of legal cannabis by keeping the 280E in place than it is if they remove it and put in this whole heavy infrastructure. And let's just say they taxed every single cannabis company 5%. It would pale in comparison to what they're making off 30% of all these expenses of all these legal companies. So it's kind of in their best interest. Not only are they making more money now, but it's already up and running. They don't have to create an entirely new legal cannabis program, all the oversight that's going to require, all the new agencies it's going to require, the physical rollout of it amongst numerous states. It's just going to be a huge clusterfuck. So that's why the federal government's been so just lax about this whole thing. They're not actually making progress because they're making way more money now with 280E in place than they would if they legalized it. And if they legalize it, they're going to have a huge burden of all the blowback from that. Like, how do they roll it out properly? All the costs it's going to take to roll it out, all the pushback they're going to get, all the criticism they're going to get from, because it's not going to go smooth, and they're going to have uphill battle on rolling it out. And then all the people that weren't in support of it are going to be like, see, I told you, you fucked up things because you legalized it. So Safe Banking Act is something completely different. It hasn't been passed yet. What this says is it's going to basically give us regular banking rights, just like any other company. We could go get loans, we could deposit money into a Wells Fargo. Really just normalizes banking for plant touching cannabis businesses. And like I explained in a previous video, all this only applies to plant touching only. So in the legal space, brands are non-plant touching. So what that means is there's no 280E. Technically, I mean, it can be considered that yes, there is 280E because the proceeds come from a Schedule 1 substance. However, as a marketing and branding company, you're not touching the cannabis plant at all. So depending on how you set up your structure, and as long as it's set up properly with the right agreements in place with the plant touching companies, as well as the right banking strategy, as well as the right tax strategy with a proper CPA. And it has to be done in conjunction with all that in order for it to work right. But technically, if you set it up right, your brand's not going to be subject to 280E, or if it is, a lot of stuff can still be rolled into cost of goods. So to lower tax burden, lower licensing fees, in some states there's no licensing fee, you just work with a license holder. And as I was explaining the other night, you have your licenses here: cultivation, manufacturing, distro, and retail. And this is all plant touching. Then you have your brands up here, which is non-plant touching. And so the brands do branding, marketing, events, social media, marketing. There's other ways of marketing, but those are some key ones. So technically, the grows the weed. They transfer it to the manufacturer. Manufacturer packages the weed or rolls the pre-rolls or fills the vapes, whatever that manufacturing process is doing for the brand. Then after it's done being manufactured, it goes over to the retail distributor. The distributor there tests it for compliance, and then they deliver it to the retail stores. Then the retail stores pay their invoice to the distributor. The distributor collects those funds. The distributor will keep what it's owed and then also reimburse the cultivation if they're owed any money for the flower. And then what happens is that distro will then issue the brand the remaining balance. And that issue is for marketing. So you see how the only connection is literally the distributor paying licensing fees to the brand. And when I say licensing, it means that you license the likeness of your brand to one of these license holders, either a cultivator, manufacturer, distributor. So that's why 280E doesn't necessarily apply, because a brand is never touching the plant at any stage. It's getting from grown to retail all through the supply chain network that the brand has no ownership of. It doesn't package its own weed, it doesn't deliver it to the stores, it doesn't grow it. The brand is the brand, it's the marketing vehicle. So Safe Banking Act applies more to the plant touching businesses. As of now, brands, you're a marketing company. You can get away with not having this plant touching burden because you're not touching the plant. The third promise from Trump is state level autonomy. And what that means is that the feds will not interfere with state laws. So we saw this big in California way back in the day. So really anywhere from 96 on up to 2018, honestly. But in the heyday of the medical days, of the Prop 215 days, they were shutting down retail stores heavily. Grows as well, but they were really targeting retail stores. And they weren't even stores back then, they were called collectives, a co-op. And what that was a collective of medical patients that basically allowed their prescriptions to be carried by the grower and the retailer. And what these prescriptions did is allowed the grower and the retailer to show, hey, I have thousands of patients I'm taking care of. So yeah, we need all this plants, we need all these pounds of weed, we need all these products in the store because we have, 1,000 patients, let's say. What would happen is these collectives were representing the patients. They were growing the weed, they were making the products for the patients as they needed them. And back in the day, there was definitely a tone of like, that it was a joke. Even amongst people that worked in cannabis, they're like, oh yeah, you can go get a prescription because you get headaches or because you have anxiety. But knowing what I know now, and also being a consistent cannabis user for certain things like this myself, I've realized that it's not bullshit, it's true. And even though back in the day, selling weed, moving weed, breaking down weed, growing weed, even back in the Prop 215 days, always felt like we were kind of getting over on the system because, oh yeah, we got these prescriptions and we're making medicine. And what I now know later on is like, we actually were making medicine. We just chose to be shackled by the taboo that the world put around cannabis. And so in those early days, it was kind of looking at it like, yo, we're not doing this for the medical reasons. We're doing this because the medical reasons allow us to operate safely. But nowadays, with all the science that's come out, all the results we've seen, all the people it's helped, you can't not accept that there are medicinal purposes for this. And so what was happening back in the day with these medical collectives is, and this happened under Obama too a lot, was the feds would come in and raid these collectives and put people away. People like Luke from Profit, he's a brand up in Sacramento, and I don't know his whole story in and out, but I do know him personally, and I know that he had a cannabis dispensary, a co-op, back then what they called, and he was doing everything to the extent of the law that they had written, but he was still messed with, still taken in, still shut down, arrested, put in jail. The feds have the ability to interfere with these state programs because technically it's still Schedule 1. So if at any point in time the feds wanted to come in, they could pull that card and be like, yo, it's Schedule 1, I don't care what your state law says. So Trump is basically saying what he said in the past, and we'll see if he comes true with it. He's gonna allow state level autonomy. They're not gonna come in and mess with medical programs, not gonna come in and mess with recreational programs, but that hasn't been publicly stated. So we'll see if Trump lives up to that. The next is decriminalization and clemency. We see that a little bit here and there, but that's where releasing nonviolent cannabis offenders, if they didn't have guns, if they didn't have other drugs, if they weren't doing assault or robberies, things like that, and they just got caught with some weed, these people have a chance of getting out of jail potentially. And it's nowhere near enough, at least not yet, where the people that have gotten out through clemency isn't even a drop in the bucket compared to how many people are still incarcerated for nonviolent cannabis crimes. And the fucked up part is that there's all these rich corporate, heavily funded cannabis companies statewide or nationwide that are literally doing hundreds of millions in revenue in some cases. There's all these people still stuck in jail for selling 10 pounds, 5 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds, doesn't matter, but it's nowhere near the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds legally being sold now that these big corporations can do with no skin off their back. They literally are just running businesses now. And people like us that have tried doing this in the past and that have been actually incarcerated for it, they're not even being able to be let out right now. So it's like a catch-22, and it's not fair in my opinion. So the other thing Trump promised is medical research. And again, that definitely relies on it going to Schedule 3. But in my opinion, Schedule 3, the only benefit that's gonna do is bringing more investment money to the market. So that's not necessarily a good thing, but it will raise the market up a bit. And that's gonna be like what happened in 2018, 2019, where a lot of investors got in the market and they overinflated it in a sense. And so now we're seeing the results of that in 2025, 2024, where the market softened a bit because a lot of this investment money exited. So now these companies are forced to actually figure out how to make money the real way, like actually sell stuff and make profit and keep their expenses low. Versus when they just had investment money, they're just spending it knowing that there's more behind it and like, oh, fuck it, we'll figure out how to make profit in a year or two. And that's where a lot of businesses did, but it's silly in my opinion. So if it goes to Schedule 3, now they can do more medical research. They can find out not only that it does have medical benefits, but they can find out intricacies like what strains can do this or that for certain people, or what types of cannabinoids can fix things or heal things, what terpenes can do in conjunction with the cannabinoids. And there's so much more that none of us even realize because there hasn't been like deep scientific studies with control groups and peer reviews and all this stuff that everything else is studied like that, whether it be from our food to our air, everything, but just not cannabis. So a big part about what Trump's gonna do, or what he's proposed to do, I should say, ultimately doesn't even come down to his decision. There's the Senate that has to vote in a lot of this stuff. And if they're not on the same page, you have that potential going against you. The definite bigger thing here that all this kind of hinges on is who becomes the head of the DEA. The main nominee right now, his name is Terrence Cole. And he's appointed to be the head of the DEA in Trump's administration. They're waiting on a final, I believe, Senate approval. But when asked publicly, does he plan to reschedule cannabis? Does he care about cannabis? Does he think that there's medical benefits? Ultimately, from my read on the situation, this guy is not for cannabis. He's been against it for many, many years. He thinks it increases the suicide rates amongst children thinks there's psychosis issues that can potentially come about from weed, feels that there isn't medical benefits to it. However, he also hasn't said that he's not gonna ban it or push it down in priority. What he has said is that as soon as he gets into office, he's gonna review it and understand both sides of the situation and make his decision there. So publicly, up until now, he hasn't said one way or the other. However, just looking on his track record, he's never been a proponent of cannabis, and coming into it, he still feels like it's affecting the illegal market that these licensed cannabis programs are allowing, whether it be other ethnicities such as cartels or illegal immigrants that are being human trafficked and basically used as slave labor. I'm not trying to say that that doesn't happen. It definitely is happening here in California and in other states, and it sucks that it is happening because ultimately it's fucking up the market for the legal market for people that are actually trying to pay their taxes and actually do the business according to the laws. So this DEA, the head of the DEA, is looking at a lot of these things as he'd rather just squash it out and go back to what it was and have it be fully illegal and just not give Americans access to cannabis. And the other messed up part is that the same thing is happening with hemp right now, where they're trying to pull it away from states. And hemp was ultimately the legal access for people to cannabinoids. So if you made it this far, means this content is for you, means you're definitely aligned with the cannabis industry, most likely with an entrepreneurial mindset. So if you like the content you're seeing here, be sure to join the school community. It's free. The link is below. And it's where we go over branding stuff every day about in the licensed market, how to get in, suppliers, supply chain, how to do your brand properly, how to do marketing, how to do sales. So we touch on all that. So if you want help getting your brand to this point, getting it into the legal market profitably, I also offer one-on-one guidance where not only myself, but my entire team, we put in all the work necessary to actually get your brand built out properly so that it succeeds in the licensed market. If that sounds like something you're interested in, click the link below. I made a 30-minute brand building course. It's super insightful and it'll help you out a lot. Okay, so appreciate your guys' support. All this information is free for you. I really want to see you put it to use. I want people to get their brands out there. We got to stand up against the corporate cannabis and have all of these independent brands. We all got to take a piece of the market share so we can stand up against corporate cannabis together. So let's make it happen. Follow my IG and be sure to leave comments if this helped you out.